So welcome everybody, and thank you Morgan and Jen and Jules for joining us, and thank you to everybody out there. For those of you who are guests, Jules, we've met before. Jen, Morgan, I'm Aaron DeVore, so happy to meet you and thank you for coming. So we've all just watched a spectacular film, and I want you to know that last night, GLAAD Media Awards took place in Los Angeles, and this film won the award for the Outstanding Documentary.
I have to say, we haven't met yet, but hi. I'm looking at these glorious faces, which I did just see in Los Angeles not that many hours ago. And I'm sorry that I'm looking down, but I gotta tell you, you three that cannot see this incredible room full of very beautiful faces who laughed a lot at our film, and sorry to jump in, Aaron, but it is a real suspicious scenario when audiences don't think our movie is funny. And I just want to say thank you in advance of this conversation.
And they laughed in the right places. Okay, so I'd like to introduce our guests. Jace, and you've seen all these guests on the screen, but let me just say a few words. So Jace Joint is a director and writer whose films have won a number of other awards in addition to the one that I just mentioned. The documentary, Framing Agnes, in addition to the GLAAD Award, was named the Best Movie of the Year by The New Yorker and premiered at the Sundance Film Festival, where it won the Next Innovator Award and the Next Audience Award. And I am proud to say that Chase is also a professor in the Gender Studies Department here at UVic, so he's one of ours. Morgan M. Page, a writer, artist, and historian based in London, UK. So Morgan, are you in London right now and it's the middle of the night, early in the morning?
I am. It's 4 a.m. to me right now.
Morgan!
So thank you, Morgan. What dedication. Thank you.
So
Morgan is the creator
and woke up like this.
Morgan is the creator of One from the Vaults. If you are not familiar with it, I recommend it. A podcast that brings you all of the dirt, gossip, and glamour from trans history. And she is also, with Chase, the co-writer of a new book, 2022 book, about Boys Don't Cry, about the film Boys Don't Cry. And, of course, Framing Agnes. Jen Richards, I'm sure is known to many of you, a writer, actor, and the creator and star of Her Story, which explores the dating lives of trans women. And it was the first independently made digital series to be nominated for an Emmy. Jen is also a longtime transgender representation consultant for TV and film and a trans rights activist. Jen, thank you so much for joining us. And all of these folks do so much for all of us. Jules, nice to see you again. Jules Gill-Peterson is an associate professor of history at Johns Hopkins University. And probably in addition to this film, she's best known for her histories of the transgender child. And she is a general co-editor of TSQ, the Transgender Studies Quarterly. And her next book, I'm sure, is also going to be fantastic. It's called A Short History of Trans Misogyny. And Jules, how soon is that coming out? It's from Verso.
Supposedly January of next year. I was just finishing up revisions today somehow.
Wonderful. Okay, so those are our panelists, and thank you for joining us. So I'm going to ask a few questions, and Chase may have a few questions or random comments or jokes or whatever to add in. So I want to start with Chase and Morgan, and with the obvious question, what inspired you to tell this story now?
Yeah, we can definitely sort of hand off this answer. Very organically disclosed in the film is the true origin story, which is a deep and enduring friendship with Kristen Schilt, who small story of an aside, I was a corduroy pant wearing butch lesbian identified person in the back of a sociology of deviant behavior class, and Kristen was a half jet black, half peroxide blonde, goth looking person walking in the front of that room, and we were at UCLA, and we looked at each other across the blonde hair and juicy shorts and thought, we need each other to survive in this room, and we've been friends ever since. And Agnes is a very organic extension of our geeky curiosities, and upon encountering these transcripts, recognize the potential for creative projects and interventions. And Morgan, I'm very happy to hand it to you.
I mean, I joined this project just because Chase asked me to, but it was well in motion. I'll do just about anything for Chase, but it was well in motion before I even joined. I guess what I found really fascinating was this idea that not only had Chase gone looking for the famous Agnes, but had found all of these other case files that no one had ever heard of before. And a lot of my work is about thinking about ways of animating and making more accessible the past, especially obviously the trans past. It's all I do. I'm a one-trick pony, but yeah, that was just really exciting to me. I was really invested in like the myth of our film. That's what drew me in, that and Chase. Chase and I, I guess I can say, like, buzzed around each other in Toronto for like 10 years before we ever actually really started working together or became friends. I think mostly I just amused Chase on Twitter, which is proof that if you are funny on social media, lots of great things can happen to you. Also terrible things, awful things. Don't search my name on Mumsnet, it's awful. But mostly good things. So that's my advice, kids. Be funny on Twitter and it'll all work out.
Thank you. That's great advice. Okay, everybody, remember where you heard that first. Okay, Chase, your previous film, No Ordinary Man, was described by a New Yorker as a genre unto itself. Those are pretty strong words, high praise. Now, there's lots of us, myself especially, who are not part of the film world. So can you describe what you were attempting to accomplish in framing Agnes that was building on this new genre and this approach? And talk about the genre and what they were talking about, please.
Oh yeah, favorite question. Let's go straight to formalism. So, you know, I'm very suspicious of documentary as a genre. I think documentary has done an extraordinary amount of violence to trans and gender nonconforming and non-binary stories and subjects. I think we look back at a history of documentary representation as outsider-in portraits of communities that authors and directors know very little about. And I think that the form of documentary is responsible for some of that violence. So I think the form of interrogation, the ways in which verite filmmaking, so on the ground intimate portraiture, tries to extract and excavate people's life stories to create narrative momentum. And so part of the enduring motivation for the film is to think about the structure of the frame as something that is teaching us about trans life and trans representation. So how do we feel when we encounter the intimacy of something like a Super 8 technology? And it doesn't matter if that doesn't mean anything to you. What you can think of when you're watching is the smaller frame that has a grainier texture. What you might recognize is that the subjects, when captured in that way, are looking in the camera. It's probably clear to us, based on their relaxed behavior, that they know the person on the other side of. If our strategies are working, this is what we're hoping is happening, right? And then when we snap you to the industrial talk show frame where we're in black and white, we're in cameras that are in fixed positions that are always over someone's shoulder, we understand that the audience for that interaction is elsewhere and is probably very little to do with what the person on stage wants or can control. And so those are formal choices. Those are frame-based choices that when we start to run them alongside each other, cause us to move toward the subjects on screen and or start to alienate us from them. And so one of the clearest examples of those experiments is when we have an opportunity to be with Angelica as Georgia in the church with the celeb cameo of Brian Michael Smith. Come on. If you know, you know. And it's the only time in the film where we're not really talking to you and you get lulled and we strategically play some music and we're in a kind of atmospheric narrative moment. And then Jules, our extraordinary guide, snaps us out of it to say, why are you feeling that way? And you're feeling that way because we have put you in that place. And there's a kind of strategic, formal, theoretical exercise that's happening between all of us on the film and I think all of us behind the film, which is to say it's a very queer and trans crew that is producing these frames and images and structures. And so we're trying to create a conversation that keeps moving throughout.
Anybody else want to comment on that? No, okay. So, no, they're going. Okay, so Chase, tell us a little bit more about who worked on this film. So we can see the people who face the camera, but there were a lot of other people that we never saw on camera. And you made some strategic choices about who got involved in the film. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. So we have a cinematography team, Aubrey Bernier-Clark, Ava Benjamin Shore, extraordinary humans who, if you're close to the internet, you can Google and find their work. The entire team was organized first by who we felt resonated and positioned themselves close to the story or close to the stakes of the choices we were making. And then, you know, a lot of times we talk about this film and we use the language of casting, but if we want to think about our on-screen interlocutors, they are also transcultural producers who have decades worth of moving image, gallery-based writing work that informs who they are and how they arrive on screen. So I identify them as actually part of the off-screen crew as well, because we're relying upon those histories when we actually position them in frame. And then there were lots of folks on set too who were there for the first time or were in their first handful of set experiences and trying to open up the possibilities for folks to have experiences and be a part of what we were making and influence what we were making.
So everyone on the crew was trans?
Not everyone, but our numbers are good.
Okay, Jen. One of the somewhat unique features about this film is how many of the people who worked on it are trans. And I use the term trans plus to include all the different ranges of trans people. So you are by no means new to acting. How was it different or not for you to work on this film with so many trans people involved throughout the entire business of making the film?
I'm very happy to say it wasn't exceptional to work with so many trans people. I've actually been blessed to work on a couple of projects that had a majority of trans crew. The documentary Disclosure, which had been done kind of overlapping a little bit with Framing Agnes, took a very similar approach. And it makes a tremendous difference. I've often been the first or only trans person on a large show, you know, a network type show where I'm the only person and I'm often there on the show to be trans. And so I walk in with that expectation and carry what you might call a burden of representation, of feeling like I have to represent all trans kind for everybody on this set so that they want to hire other trans people in the future. And you're constantly navigating both your performance as the role and your performance as a trans person to assist, you know, casting crew, which can sometimes, you know, increase the demands on your role as an actor. But ultimately, I take as a privilege. I'm very lucky to be in this industry, and I have the capacity to do that work, so I do it. But in these kinds of situations, like Framing Agnes affords, it allows you to drop that extra level of performance and just be yourself with other people. And I do think that ultimately it makes for a better performance. The one other performance-specific aspect that made this unique was just embodying an actual person, having an actual transcript of her actual words, knowing her life story. And so that was a different kind of performance and a very different approach.
Thank you. And Chase, were your words also from something in the documents that you unearthed?
Yes, absolutely. So Morgan and I had the wild opportunity to take what were excerpted sections of each of the transcripts, pulled from the archival research, and then build the talk show frame around these encounters. So obviously when I walk out and I say, you know, good evening, Harold Garfinkel is not saying good evening to Agnes in this way. And so we spent a lot of time trying to play with the very slippery authority of what I'm doing in the film. How close does it get to Garfinkel versus Mike Wallace versus Chase Joint, right? There's a strange triangle of authorship that's happening there that really is where the writing of the film takes shape in order to try and move across that line between these contexts of medicine and media. But the interactions, the volleying back and forth between Garfinkel and the subjects are transcript conversations.
Thank you. Jules. And now, I'm not officially a historian, so I may have this wrong, but I think a job of the historians is to do their best to render an accurate account of the past. And of course, histories are always incomplete and always involve a degree of conjecture. So how did you understand your role going into the project? And also looking back on it now, how did that change along the way?
That's a great question. And I will say for the record, Aaron, I think you're a fine historian. But I think part of the interesting thing about doing trans history is these kind of conventions run aground, but in interesting ways, right? In my day job or in my primary job as a professor, I'm happy to say to my colleagues, like, or to people, like, I think of myself as generally an empiricist. I am interested in like what happened in the past, but there's a strange way that things like accuracy and truth start to fall apart almost the further you burrow into what really happened. In other words, the frames through which, or the archives through which we have any access at all, particularly to trans people's past or trans people in the past, just raises all these like interesting questions about the problem of knowing anything about people who came before you. But I also think we're often sort of greeted with the dilemma of like, well, we're not dispassionate, especially as trans people. When we go to the past, thank goodness, we're incredibly passionate. The reason we're there is often existential, personal, or I mean, these are things Morgan could talk about better than me. I was going to say also like flirtatious and exciting. We're just like obsessed with finding people in the past to make sense of who we are and how we got into the dilemmas of our lives. But I think, one thing that really felt different for me, and part of why I was willing to say yes when Chase invited me to be, part of this project in a more formal way, was that I had felt so much. And in our conversations, we had talked a lot about, just how much to me I felt like whatever the point was of doing the research I do isn't really just about getting the story right. Like that matters. I enjoy doing it, but there's always this remainder, this other dimension that's much more interesting to me, much more satisfying, much harder to name. But that some of that had to do with that kind of dislocation between myself and my research, or between me and my writing. And so one thing I was excited to experience coming into this was like, well, what if I got to be a historian, but also like Jules, and actually, what would it feel like to merge those two versions of myself, which frankly, I had never, whether or not anyone was really telling me not to, I had just not yet in my career found the means to merge them, which I think is a very common experience for a lot of trans people. So anyways, it was sort of exciting to go into, a very meta, very historiographical kind of project where certain things that I otherwise understand intellectually became so much more alive, watching people play them out, watching like Jen act out Barbara, but understanding that that's not verite, even though it's like, based on a primary source, but then switching to listening to Jen, in conversation with Chase, right? All of those frame shifts to me are a beautiful, not just representation, right? They're not representing how you do history, like they are enacting it. They are doing the problem of history writ large, which I think for trans people is just so exciting, right? Like, because all of our, because part of the way transphobia has operated is by structuring our lives around fantasies of deception, lies, concealment, right? Invisibility versus visibility. It just means there is no sort of final story to tell. And I actually find that really satisfying because, it's like you can't ever really get revenge as a historian on the past, but you can kind of play it like, it's like the record ends and you start it again, or you play it backwards or whatever. And it's just sort of satisfying to sort of play these stories over and over again and know that, like, one way of having the last laugh is that it never solidifies into an object of knowledge, into something totally knowable, which is exactly what Garfinkel would have wanted. I mean, he's a good sociologist. I'm sure he wouldn't have said it that way. But, like, mid-century science wants to pin down trans people. And in fact, history answers that you can't pin us down. And I just continue to find that to be really thrilling. And I feel like I didn't really fully understand that until being a part of the project. Certainly, but also actually just sitting down and watching the film, I was like, oh, I get it. I get what being a historian means now.
Jules, if I can stay with you for a moment longer, I don't know if I wrote this down. I don't know if I got it quite right, but I think you said in the film that you wrote the book to avoid transition. Did I get that right?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Okay, so that really struck a chord to me. This is not the first time I've seen the film, but that's the first time I clicked on that. Because in my own story, I wrote a great big fat book. It's 720 pages. And it wasn't until after I finished the book that I figured out that I was trans. And people who knew me said, "Are you kidding? It took you that long?" There's a couple of people who have known me here long enough. They were all waiting for me to figure it out. So I'm wondering if you could elaborate a little bit more on why you made that statement in the film and what that was like for you.
Yeah, it's so funny because I guess at the time that, I came into this project at the end, just to say for, so that everyone knows, right? I'm the last arrival. Everything else had been shot until, we came together in 2021 to figure out how, in that moment of the pandemic, we would be able to shoot. And so we're doing those narration scenes. So in any case, at that moment in my life, I was feeling so turned inside out, as I think like a lot of, especially trans women feel, like a couple of years, into public transition, where it's just like, oh, okay, well, I see what trans misogyny means in part, that I have like no control over my image and how I circulate in the world. And I'm just sort of trying to live with that. And I was really moved and took to heart one of the commitments that Chase communicated to me early on, and that all of the footage really made clear to me, which is like, this is not going to be a confessional documentary. And the point was not for all of us to come and, spill our guts and then try and plug that into these people in the past. And so I was so happy about that. And so there isn't a lot of I don't share like a ton about myself. Well, I mean, I'm talking about my research process, right? But I'm not like telling you my life story throughout the course of the film, or trying to map myself, for example, vis-a-vis Agnes in any more than just sort of structural kinds of ways, right? But that particular anecdote felt important to me because I feel like, the journey in part that I get to go on screen is about understanding, and this really did happen to me, right? Like integrating a kind of intellectual academic version of myself with whatever the rest of myself is. I don't know how to call those two things separately. But I think there's something about the kind of, the trans arts of dissociation that a lot of people can relate to. And, perhaps it explains something why we're all so smart and, kind of effortless at times, but also why trans people can really pour themselves into things in these unique ways. And one of the strange feelings for me about working on my first book was that, by making it an avoidance strategy or the ultimate form of procrastination, that actually had positive value. I credit that to the rigor of a certain way I used to think, or that I was thinking at the time, that I'm really grateful for. But I can't do that anymore thanks to too many injections of estrogen and having relaxed, right? And no longer being so uptight that I would rather, write a 250-page book than think about myself, right? And so I think part of what was so interesting to me in mentioning that was that it was almost, I think I was saying it to myself in so many ways, but then I really like to tell people this, I said this last night at the GLAAD Awards, this film really gave me the voice that I use now. you know, all the ways that I talk, the ways that I think, the way that I feel confident and comfortable and in command of my professional and personal self, I really think like matured during the process, like literally on screen, you're like watching it happen, right? And so I'm kind of glad to like sneak that little nugget in to give folks a kind of sense that like that really for me is like a marked shift. But I suspect it's one that probably many people could relate to at different points in their lives, right? Where something kind of becomes a tipping point and you just find yourself in that peculiar trans situation where you're like, oh, all of a sudden, like I make so much more sense to myself than I ever did. Very funny enough, right? Often all the people around you will be like, yeah, that was so obvious. Why are you the last person to know things about yourself? And it's like, well, anyways, that's conversation.
I get it. So I'd like to take that last question, change it slightly, and put it to the three of you is, did making this film change you? And if so, how? Jules has just told us about how it did change her in some ways.
How has my life not changed since I've been in near daily contact with Chase? I feel like, in a good, like, many changes to the way that I think about the world and the way that I move in the world. Not that I had never done anything in film before, but boy, did it become the whole center of my life real quick through making this movie and everything that has come subsequently. I think it certainly reinforced a lot of the ideas I have about history, particularly the ultimate unknowability of the past and of people of the past, right? Like the big problem in trans history is the fact that we can simply never know what someone's interior life is in the present or the past. We can only know their material conditions, like how they live that life. We can't, even if someone left a very detailed, like Anais Nin style diary, we can't actually know that any of that's true. We can only know that that's what they wanted people to think, right? And I think the process of working on our film really underscored that to me, including the process of promoting the film and what we say about it and what we leave out. So I'll pass over to Chase now.
Oh, I love it so much. And I'm hopping in to try to deflect what you've just said about my impact on your life, to just say that I think what the film is doing is opening up what Morgan already does in so many other places. I mean, if anyone has listened to One from the Vaults, you are on the most extraordinarily joyous and also rigorous journey into a trans past. And I think there's something really significant about the tagline, the dirt, gossip, and glamour, because those priorities allow for a different kind of storytelling momentum. And it's not about the truth versus deception. It's about a different orientation to who you're paying attention to whose stories get elevated. And I think that there's something so energizing. And I've never really made this connection, when you speak about our lack of interiority or our access to interiority, I think often about sociology. And I think about how Garfinkel is someone who is asking a lot of the how questions, not the why questions. And so because he asks the how do you get up in the morning? How do you go to work? How do you navigate public space? We're able to play in that territory in the transcripts in a kind of one-for-one manner, but we are not actually projecting inside into the strategies of Barbara. We get more of the strategies of Barbara through hanging out with Jen, because Jen's actually able to articulate and translate and interpret in certain ways. So there's some interesting new sparks, and we've been talking about the film for a long time, and it's true, we've become a little bit routinized in some of the ways in which we strategize what we say and what we don't, because of course one of the conceits of the film is that there's no behind the scenes. We keep reminding you that there's no behind, we keep showing you more and more and more, but of course there's a behind the scenes, right? There's a strategic and structured behind the scenes that's designed to also protect those within it. And it's not some great conspiratorial strategy, but it is one that I think people think, oh, well, you've left everything out on the dance floor, as they say. And we're like, no. There's lots that's not on the dance floor. Who do you think we are,
But Jace, how did it change you?
Oh, it's transformed my life. I mean, I really sincerely feel like this film is the most enduring reminder that collaboration is the future. I think it is not interesting to try to tell stories by yourself. I am totally uninterested in moving toward my own ideas without a kind of collective investment in the questions that we are struggling over and troubling over. I do not think that my ideas are the best or are right. I think it is so incredibly joyous and dynamic to be wrong in collaboration, because you can move differently within projects within that kind of structured feedback loop that takes a lot of trust and a lot of vulnerability and a lot of willingness to keep showing up. And so one of the things that we employed in this film in particular is a series of ongoing rough cuts and ongoing conversation about the moves we were making, and paying close attention to the ways in which people were like, nope, and or that's very confusing, and or what is this film trying to do? Like, those are really important early stages that started to shape and arrive us at a film that sometimes still people say, what? What is that film trying to do? But I feel much more comfortable, you know, with where we've landed on account of that very long and enduring process.
Thank you. Now, Jen, you deflected very nicely at the beginning. And was the making of this film, did it change you in any way?
The making of the film itself, in a few different senses. I think the obvious one is anytime you encounter an ancestor, and however we want to think about that, and you connect to them, particularly in such an intimate way where you're actually choosing to embody someone else and really think about their life from that kind of interiority, it becomes a part of you. I mean, I think that's true for any actor who takes their craft seriously, any part they do. But, you know, as Jules mentioned earlier, I think as trans people are always looking for that as well, just to kind of help figure out where we are and where we belong, and to recover those kinds of legacies and a sense of belonging. So in that sense, Barbara certainly helped shape me a little bit more so than most of the other parts I get to play. And then in a kind of a strange coincidence on a personal level, the film happened to overlap with what is probably the most important aspect of my life, which is I actually met my now wife the day before I filmed Framing Agnes and like literally came to set and talked to Chase about this woman I just met, and was excavating that as well, and so it's kind of carried me through all of that, so that on another level is really important as well. And then only later, because I am actually one of the people Chase talked about who said, what is happening with this film? I don't really understand it. Like, as we were filming it, like, so we're doing this, but then we're also talking about this, but then it's also me over here, and you're always moving the camera to see who's not seen. And I really didn't understand what we were doing. And it was only when I saw the cut with Jules in it, I was like, oh, okay, now it's starting to really make sense to me. And it's a lot of what Jules says in the film, that as someone who has thought and talked a lot about trans visibility specifically, she caused me to question all of my assumptions about visibility, more specifically visibility as an intrinsic good, and caused me to interrogate that. And as someone who lives very visibly, it's very much in the public eye, that did cause me to really question myself and question some of the things I was doing and the role of those things. Not necessarily changed my mind to the opposite way, but certainly created a lot more mindfulness about what I do and how I speak about trans visibility.
Thank you. And of course, today is Transgender Day of Visibility. So here we are, excuse me, talking about that. And one of the things that came up in the film towards the end, and I don't think this phrase was actually used in the film, but it came up as a concept, and it's a phrase from sociology and from this period of sociology, is the concept of civil inattention, and that being a privilege, to be able to walk through the world without people staring at you, commenting about you, being suspicious about you, causing you to be a problem by your just very existence. And I think that many people, most people in this room have experienced that to some degree. I certainly have experienced that. And for me, transition made that disappear. I now have the privilege of civil inattention. I get to walk through the world that way. But this is something that came up over and over again, I think, in the film without that phrase actually being used. And I wonder if any of you would like to comment on that concept.
I mean, I think that Right. I keep forgetting today is the day of visibility because I spent half of it on a plane, which is I'm delighted to say, thanks to the extreme mask I wear on the plane, I'm very visible, but incredibly invisible because no one wants to look at me. So that was nice. But anyways, I think that to me really, I don't know, like it was one of these things that I feel like I've been thinking through this concept for a long time, or circling around it, dancing towards it. And just again, the incredible supercharged feeling of being in collaboration in concert with everyone, which is entirely how I understand how I was able to just like say a bunch of things spontaneously while they're in conversation. But, so one of those that really has stuck with me is, towards the end of the film, just this kind of moment of like, well, isn't this archive pretty small? Not a lot of people here, don't really represent even LA in the 50s, not that well represented. Oh, well, actually, that's kind of great because that means like 99.999% of trans people didn't have to be in this archive. And maybe they were damn happy that they weren't. And aren't they, it doesn't mean they didn't experience, all sorts of hypervisibility or moments of being interpolated or, turned into an object in the world. But, in some ways, like, I don't know, it's just such a back and forth for me. It's such a point of ambivalence, like how to learn to honor, right? Because it's like, okay, well, there just might not be records of all of that. So on the one hand, it's a shame not to know because, of course, that means we're operating at a deficit as insofar as like the depth of aggression and violence that trans people experience as like the condition of their possibility in the world. Actually, we're always under appreciating that. But on the other hand, it's kind of nice for there not to be a record, because I think about this all the time when I'm writing, about really awful stuff. I'm like, it kind of makes me feel bad. It doesn't kind of, it absolutely makes me feel bad to be recirculating like the worst things that ever happened to people, including things that are so bad, but just happened every day, and writing about them and then putting them back out in the world again, obviously differently than the way they were first archived. But like, that's not a philanthropic act, right? And it's not without its own ethical dilemma. And so there is a way that I feel like it's almost like a meditation or a mantra or like a practice to come back to that I feel like the film helped me understand, is that like it's our job to learn how to appreciate and love and affirm everything we don't know about the past, including what happened to the people we care about, including who those people were, right? And so can we get to a place where it feels genuinely important and substantial to know that we're, first of all, many more trans people in the past than we'll ever know, because a lot of them fit in well enough, in fact, not to stand out. But even all the ones who did, there aren't enough records left behind to even follow them all around. So you could think about it, since the film is so much about being in LA, like next time you're walking down your street or driving through your neighborhood, can you cultivate a relationship to the absent presence of all the trans people who may have been there at some point and to whom many sorts of things happened, but who elude the capture of history, including the capture of our attention? I think there's something difficult about that, right? I don't even mean to hold that up as an unambiguous good, but I think the film asks us to consider what would have to change in our lives to accommodate that fact. And I guess our lives there, I meant queer and trans people. I think for the public, it's a different version of that question, right? Like I really genuinely in this moment want the public to understand that the world they move through has been trans for a long time, because like, not having to believe that, authorizes all sorts of population level killing projects and genocidal aspirations. But when we're not in that realm, I think there's a really interesting unanswerable kind of question that to me is just a refrain that I want to hold on to. How to learn to be in relationship with people and events and things that you can never actually encounter. That is mystical in all the right kinds of ways.
Thank you, Jules. Did anybody else want to take a crack at that? No.
That's a hard one to follow up on.
Yes, it is.
I do think it's really interesting. Like, I and we touch on this a little bit in the film, but the sort of contemporary discourse is that like the more visible you make yourself, and by virtue of that, the more profitable your identity becomes, the closer you are to liberation, right? Like, it's the current capitalist lie that if you just make yourself into the biggest influencer with the most followers ever, no one can touch you, everything will be perfect, your whole life will be handed to you for free with a whole bunch of SpawnCon deals, which I spent a lot of time judging my peers for today. But it's 5 a.m. and I'm really salty. But anyway, I do think it's really interesting what Jules said, the to capture people in the past, you know, and I'm thinking about that in terms of like constraining people as well. There is a freedom to not being known, right? And even within my own life, I can see that, as I'm sure there are other people here who, like me, transitioned long before, you know, back in the Stone Age, long before we were, you know, having our transgender tipping point and the current genocidal mode. And in that period, which for me was the late 90s, early 2000s, the sky was the limit. I mean, I couldn't get a job necessarily, and my idea of what my life could be was very constrained in a way that it isn't necessarily now. But I also was not subject to people creating new laws to try to outlaw my healthcare and other aspects of my existence. I wasn't living in the sort of perpetual state of anxiety and worry over whether or not I may need to flee any of the several countries I'm regularly inhabiting, you know, speaking here from Turf Island in particular. So there is that freedom of not being known, but there's also no putting the cat back in the hat, in the bag, cat in the hat, I don't know. Now that we're out there, we've got to do something with our visibility, which hopefully isn't just ads for Uber. But
Morgan and Paige, 5 a.m. is really working for you in a lot.
I'll second that.
sorry, I would not normally be so specific. Anyway, I'll just leave it there before I get myself into more trouble. Someone's going to tweet something at me or the many people that I've just dragged, but
yeah,
oh well.
You were not wrong. But it made me think too, like, isn't there something so helpful? Again, I was just thinking, like, the problem also with the archive is, like, for each of these people who we meet through these transcripts with Garfinkel, like, that's presumably a blip in the course of their life. I mean, how important the blip was to them, we'll never know. The transcripts can't tell us. And I just think, again, there's something so helpful about how, like, the actors bring that to life, right? Like, I guess I was just thinking, as you were talking, Morgan, I was like, right, I don't know the rest of Barbara's life. She talks about her life, but actually it's helpful for me to think about Barbara in the version of Barbara in the archive is like this much Barbara. And then there was a whole person akin to Jen Richards, right? Who not only walked off set at the end of filming this, but like in real life in the 1950s, the real Barbara got in her car and left UCLA, right? Or took a streetcar or whatever, right? And went on to have a life. And maybe that life was conditioned by what had transpired, you know, in the interviews, but we never know that, right? I mean, except under other circumstances when you can reconstruct someone's life in a much broader way. But in a lot of archival situations, you'll just never know, right? And there's something about conferring personhood, right, back on to these trans people and understanding that they did more than just like negotiate the medical apparatus. That might have been really important, right? But I think we all feel strongly that those are not the only ways we want to be known. But it's like you have to confer personhood back on the person through all the things you'll never know. And that just to me feels like such a delicious riddle. How do you do that? It's imaginative, right? But it's great.
Spoken like a historian.
Yeah. We found this guide.
This has been a fabulous evening. I want to give Chase a small gift, and Jen and Morgan and Jules, if you were here, I would have gifts for you too. It's chocolates. Yeah, so consider yourself getting chocolates virtually. Everybody, tomorrow, I hope to see you here early. We're starting with the elders panel as our plenary tomorrow morning. And Sunday morning, we have a youth panel. And, oh, you've got your chocolates, great. Good. Okay, so please, I look forward to seeing you tomorrow, and you folks are welcome to join us online. Everything is online, so you don't have to leave the conference now. You can be part of it over the next couple of days if you would like. We would love to have you. And Julia Serrano tomorrow night. So thank you all.
Thanks for hanging out with us.
Thank you so much for everything that you do. Framing Agnes is wonderful, and thank you all.